We now look at Israel and Hamas in our own times, right as we're speaking. And you can see that the Chamberlains of the world, the Halifaxes of the world, frankly, so much of the intelligentsia in America, who were isolationists at the time, they allowed that vacuum of evil to flourish. We're marching along that path, whistling merrily as we go, not realizing that evil is flourishing, and it flourishes because we're gutless.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. In this week's episode, we're going to do something a little different from our usual fare, in which we explore contemporary political issues, including those relating to anti-Semitism and the war in Israel. We are noting Memorial Day that just passed and the anniversary of the D-Day landings with a very interesting conversation for you with Shalom Lamm, the historian behind Operation Benjamin, an effort to ensure that all those Jewish members of the American Armed Services who fell during the Second World War are buried under the correct markers indicating their heritage and faith. But first, a program note. We're going to be taking a break next week for the holiday of Shavuot, and when we come back, it will be with a new and exciting version of this program. After 142 episodes in a little more than 3 years, it's time for a change. And when we return on June 20th, Top Story will be called Think Twice and have a whole new look. But it will still have me as host, and will still be providing weekly commentary and interviews that will help you learn more about our world and the fight to preserve the best of the Western tradition of liberty, bearing witness against anti-Semitism and advocating for Israel and the rights of the Jewish people. You will be able to find our show under the Think Twice title on all the podcast platforms, as well as on the JNS TV channel on YouTube. My daily show, Top Story Daily, will also return, but under the name of Jonathan Tobin Daily, and will also have a new look, but still consist of my short audio podcast with my commentary on the issues of the day. That said, I still want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. You can find The Daily Show on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribe. And now to today's program. There is a stark contrast between young Israelis and young Americans right now. Most young Israelis serve in their country's armed forces, and many are now currently fighting, and tragically, some are dying in the war against the Hamas terrorists that began on October 7th. As anyone who visits Israel these days knows, one of the most inspiring aspects of Israeli life now is the way young Israelis, both those who are doing their service after high school, as well as reservists in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, are prepared to serve their country and even eager to get into the fight because they know they are defending their families and their homes, as well as the existence of the one Jewish state on the planet. By contrast, the most familiar images of young Americans in a comparable age group is of spoiled college students cosplaying as terrorists in keffiyehs and chanting for Israel's destruction and for terrorism against Jews, but then whining about not only the fact that sometimes they are arrested for violating the law, as well as for the inconveniences associated with illegally occupying and vandalizing buildings on behalf of the cause of allowing the murderers, rapists, and kidnappers of Hamas to win the war they started. But there was once a time when young Americans were as willing to serve as young Israelis. More than 80 years ago, America mobilized to fight Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. More than 16 million Americans served in the armed services during World War II, and of them, approximately 550,000 were Jewish. More than 420,000 Americans were killed, and of those, 10,000 Jews also paid the ultimate price of service to their country. We've come to call those who went through that trial the greatest generation. They had lived through the depths of the Great Depression and then were forced to fight for the survival of Western civilization in the bloodiest war in history. It's a little hard to imagine today's American youth, which has been largely indoctrinated in woke ideologies that teach them to hate their country as irredeemably racist and to despise the credo of individual rights and liberty that embody American values, doing the same. We do well to worry about what happened to our country and why it seems to have lost its way, but perhaps we can start by remembering those Americans, and specifically those Jews, who served so honorably and those who never came home to their loved ones. As the son of a World War II veteran myself, this is deeply meaningful to me, and it is also why I was so touched when I heard of the work of a group that is trying to ensure that Jews who died while doing their bit for the United States in that long-ago war are appropriately honored, especially those who fought and died, but then were denied, for one reason or another, the dignity of burial under a symbol of their own faith and heritage. And we're fortunate to have with us today a man who has made it his mission to honor those American Jews who died in the war to defeat Hitler and Tojo. Shalom Lamm is chief historian of Operation Benjamin. He has served as a member of the board of directors at Yeshiva College and was a member of the board of directors of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs. He was one of the founders of the Hatzolah Medical Rescue Squad on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. He is a graduate of Yeshiva University and the American Military University. He's published articles and essays and has been an on-air historian on a wide range of topics, including educational public policy, the U.S. Civil War, and warfare policy in the Journal of International Security. Shalom Lamm, welcome to Top Story.
Jonathan Tobin, it's so nice to see you.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today.
The pleasure is mine.
I want to start by asking you to tell us the story of Benjamin Gorodetsky and how his fate led to the creation of the Benjamin Project.
So Benjamin Gorodetsky was born in Zhytomyr and moved to America when he was 5, moved to the Bronx, and grew up there. He was a belt maker, trying to get the American dream with his parents and sister. And he joined the Army at the outbreak of World War II. He became a combat medic with the Hell on Wheels, with the 66th. And in a Luftwaffe bombing after 3 years, he was the only casualty. He was killed instantly in a Luftwaffe bombing as part of...
Where was he killed?
He was killed in France, and he's buried at the Normandy American Cemetery. So that's our first guy. We named it Operation Benjamin after Benjamin Gorodetsky. But the story starts a little beforehand. It starts with Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schachter of Yeshiva University, a very dear old friend of mine, who was leading a tour of historians to France, and it was the 70th anniversary of Normandy, so exactly 10 years ago. And the group's very small group went to visit the Normandy American Cemetery. Beautiful, hallowed ground. If you've ever seen the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, you see it there, and it's absolutely extraordinary. And he was struck by the fact that he thought that he should have seen more Jewish stars. Didn't say anything too loud, but kept that in mind. I met him.
There is one or two when they show it in the movie.
They sure do.
Spielberg found one.
Spielberg. Well, there are 149. So out of 9,400 or so soldiers there were 149. There are more now. And Rabbi Schachter came to me about a month later. We were at a party of a mutual friend, and he said, I visited the Normandy American Cemetery. It was holy, it was hallowed, it was magnificent, it was moving, but I just thought there would have been more Jewish stars. That is the beginning of Operation Benjamin. We went from there, and we came up with all sorts of theories about how many soldiers should have been there. The answer is there should have been about 240. 2.7% of U.S. casualties were Jews. So if you just do the math quickly, it's about 240. Where did all the Jews go? And we finally, after a lot of trial and error, we sort of threw a dart and hit on Benjamin Gorodetsky, and said, hey, my mechutin is a guy named Steve Lamar, a wonderful fellow, and he was an amateur genealogist, a very good amateur genealogist. And Steve, why don't you join us? Let's figure out Benjamin Gorodetsky. And he did. Turns out that Gorodetsky's parents were buried about 10 minutes from our house on Long Island. So my wife and I went on a hot date to the cemetery, and we found his parents. And of course, everybody's Jewish in the cemetery. What's he doing under a cross? And then slowly but surely began to understand. We put together a dossier about him, and we approached the American Battle Monuments Commission. That's the federal agency that's in charge of all foreign cemeteries for U.S. soldiers killed overseas.
Yeah,
And
founded after World War I.
founded after World War I, very good. In fact, the first secretary was General Pershing. So you know anything that Pershing was connected to was of massive importance. And of course, honoring America's dead was of massive importance. One of the first soldiers killed there was Quentin Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt. And in fact, he's buried today at the Normandy American Cemetery, not far from Benjamin Garadetsky, by the way. So we approached the American Battle Monuments Commission, and it wasn't a very good first meeting with them. And I want to pause and say we have a spectacular relationship with them now. But at the beginning, they didn't know who we were. We didn't know how they operated. But when we finally found our way, they realized that we were serious people. We, at that early stage, had very little idea of what we were doing, but we tried very hard. And they sort of coached us on what we needed to do. And ultimately, we had to find the closest living relatives. We had to prove with an enormous amount of documentation that he was indeed Jewish. We go back 3 generations, and we were able to do that. And in 2018, we had our very first headstone replacement at the Normandy American Cemetery. It's a beautiful affair. His family was there, and since then we've done another 24. So it's been very, very special.
Wow. It's an amazing story. And, you know, these people were lost so long ago, buried under the wrong monument. What, you know, you've told us, you know, the connection, how you got sort of dragged in, but what motivated you personally to put so much effort into this? This has become a major, you know, this has become a major part of your life. What's in your story that made this resonate so much?
It's become the overwhelming part of my life. So I went to Yeshiva University, but for graduate school, I went to American Military University, and I've got a master's degree in military history, American military history. I've always been drawn to the military, and when this question came about, it was a natural fit for me. But I have to tell you, there is a biblical component here, to me, that is very, very compelling. And that is, if you look at the quintessential Jewish story, we became a nation. We say it 2 times a day in the prayers. We became a nation at the Exodus. The Exodus is how this all starts. We go from 12 tribes, we become slaves, we become a nation. Well, what happened? 3 million people are about to leave Egypt. And if you read the narrative in Exodus, it's the plagues, and it builds up, and it's huge. You know, just to run this podcast, there are a couple people involved. So you have a staff of, I don't know, a few. Well, to take 3 million people out of Egypt, the only 3 people we know in management were Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. That's a very small staff. So what happens at the climax moment when they're about to leave? The narrative stops. Chapter 13 in Exodus. The narrative stops dead. And the craziest thing happens. The verse says, and Moses went to get the bones of Joseph. Really? You have nothing else to do at the biggest moment in Jewish history? I mean, just get enough diapers for the kids who are leaving. It's insane. And really, you have nothing else to do but get it. Joseph's been dead for 210 years. And the answer is, that's what Jews do. We don't forget our heroes. We go get the bones of those heroes.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, I think it's axiomatic that whenever Jews move someplace and start a community, the first thing they do is not to build a synagogue, it's to create a cemetery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we know that the people who deal with the dead are known as the Chevra Kadisha. This is the holy group. And I'll tell you, at the end of the day, one more, it's a chesed shel emes. Chesed means an act of loving kindness, and emes of truth. What does it mean, a loving kindness of truth? What is that? And the answer is, if I do something for you, Jonathan, you may, in the back of my mind, even if I'm sincere, maybe I hope Jonathan does something for me one day. But if I do something... Sort
of the Godfather conversation.
It's a Godfather conversation. But if I do it for Benjamin Garadetsky can't do anything for me. And so there's a purity to this. There's something noble about this, in that we're doing it for the motivation of saying thank you. Thank you for guys who gave up their lives so that we could live in lives of freedom. And I can't think of anything more exciting than that.
Yeah, it's deeply moving. Why do you think that it is only now, 79 years after the conclusion of World War II, that we've begun to think more about the Jews who fell in that conflict and whether all of them received the appropriate burial at that time. You would think that this might have come up sooner, but why do you think now?
I think it's a confluence of three events. Three things happened. One is that so many of the files have been declassified. You couldn't do this research a bunch of years ago because you couldn't have access to all the files that prove these things. So that's number one. Number two is the age of the internet. We can now search massive amounts of databases in very, very little time. And that allows us to do just enormous amounts of research. The research that the ABMC requires of us can be done by smart, good people who understand computers, databases, and those types of things. And the third thing is we're approaching an iconic year. June 6th, D-Day this year is the 80th anniversary of D-Day. That's a big, big, big deal. Just try to get a hotel room in Normandy. It's not possible. World War II resonates for so many people. A, because of the size of the conflict. B, because it was good versus evil. There was no question about that. C, so many Americans alive today had parents, uncles, aunts, grandparents who were part of that war and sort of have a thirst to know. Very much like Holocaust survivors, many of them didn't talk about it.
Yeah, I'm one of them. To be honest, my father served in the 8th Air Force, and I have his decorations, and one of the 2 battle stars on his ribbon was for his unit's participation in the Normandy land.
Oh my, well that's absolutely wonderful. Did you have you been watching Masters of the Air?
Yes, I did, and he was in the ground crew. He helped fix the planes. I was glad they at least had a character showing that, as well as a major Jewish character.
They did,
who was a real person.
Was a real person, absolutely. And I think Masters of the Air is brilliant in that we have this vision of a B-17 flying slowly over over Europe because you see it from such a distance. But when you get up close and personal and you see the brutal nature, the speed at which things went when planes are going at that kind of speed approaching each other, and the horror of it all. I mean, in 1943, one of our soldiers who, we have 2 brothers who were killed, were both buried under crosses, one in Normandy and one in the Ardennes. And they were killed 2 months apart, late 1943 and the first part of...
44, I would imagine, if we're talking about the Ardennes, right?
Well, yeah.
Battle of the Bulge.
Right. Well, the Ardennes actually is mostly flyers. In Henry Chapelle, most Battle of the Bulge soldiers are buried in Henry Chapelle. About 2/3 of the soldiers buried in the Ardennes, even though it's the site of the Battle of the Bulge, are aviators. So these guys were both, one was a B-24 tail gunner, one was a B-17 pilot. One was killed at the end of 1944. That's Charles Solomon. He's buried in Normandy. In the end of 1943, when he was killed, your chance of getting 25 missions was virtually zero. And yet they went up there and they did these amazing things. It's staggering to me to be so clear about something you're willing to die for. There are very few things today that match that have that criteria. These guys did it. And then his brother Frank, who's buried in the Ardennes in Belgium, again was under a cross. We changed that to a Star of David. He knew his brother had been killed. We have letters from him talking to his mother about it. And yet he gets into that left seat as a pilot. He takes off. He was actually flying on an RAF plane in a Lancaster heavy bomber, and he met his end that way. Staggering bravery, just staggering. How do we not think?
Yeah. You alluded to it before, but what exactly is involved in determining whether the Jewish fallen are buried under a cross or not and accounted for properly? As was the case with another Jewish soldier killed in France who very recently finally received a proper burial. I mean, tell us a little about his story and how that came about.
So you're referring to an amazing soldier, First Lieutenant Nathan Baskin. So it came about through an email. Someone sent us an email, a very fine person. His name is Eric Feinstein. He's a wonderful genealogist, and he focuses on German World War I cemeteries. Very esoteric, and he's very much a specialist. He's multilingual, and we're friends. And he knows what we do, he admires what we do. And he sent us an email and said, I found a name that doesn't make sense in a German cemetery. So I quickly look it up. We have these databases, and I said, well, that's impossible. That can't be. And it turned out that it was First Lieutenant Nathan Baskin. Nathan Baskin landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, and then took a right turn with the rest of the Army and went to the Battle of Cherbourg. And on June 23rd, he's leading a tank division, anti-tank division, the 899th Tank Division destroyers. And he goes out in a Jeep to reconnoiter his position, and boom, he's never seen him again. That was the end of Nathan Baskin. And from the American perspective, he just simply disappeared. From his family's perspective, he just disappeared. All those years ago, so sad.
He was listed as missing in action.
Missing in action, so much so that his name at the Normandy American Cemetery, there's something called the Wall of the Missing. There's 1,550 soldiers or so who are listed there who are never found. And by the way, 80 years after World War II, only 23 have been identified. All those guys are still missing. Nathan Baskin's the 24th. And what happens, the way we found him, I guess that was a spoiler alert, the way we found him is it turns out that he was injured, he was grievously wounded, and taken as a POW by the German army and taken to a Luftwaffe hospital in Cherbourg. He died that night, and with 24 other soldiers or so, was buried in a mass grave. After the war, the Germans established a cemetery in France, in Marigny, France, and 2 mass graves were combined. So a total of 52 soldiers in a mass grave within this very large German military cemetery of 12,500 German soldiers. And if you walk through, there are SS soldiers there, there are Wehrmacht soldiers there are soldiers from Poland who had no desire to be there in the first place, who were conscripted by the Nazis. But it's a very eerie thing for a Jew to walk through there. But then when you say to yourself, I go to the back and there's a mass grave, and there's a Jewish kid from Pittsburgh who's mixed in there. It was very heartbreaking for us. So we were in Normandy this past Memorial Day, about a year ago, and we were changing 2 headstones there and one in Brittany. And we took our group, there were about 60 of us, and we said we're going to be the first Jews in 79 years to visit Nathan Baskin, but it's in a German war cemetery. And we walked through the cemetery. I tell you, we had a lot of kids of Holocaust survivors with us, and some of them could not take that step forward. And they walked all the way around to get to the back. It was just too painful. And we got there, and it was incredibly moving. Rabbi Schachter was there and promising that we're going to return and try to get him. And you're there, and there's 51 German soldiers there, and we believe Nathan Baskin. And we said Kaddish, and we said Kel Mali Rachamim, and we sang Ani Mamin, and we cried. I mean, we all cried. It was very, very moving. Well, we went back and how does one get permission to exhume a German war grave? It was very difficult. There are a lot of heroes in the story. One of them is the German ambassador to Israel. Rabbi Schachter and I went to see the German ambassador to Israel. We figured if anyone will be sensitive to this, he's the guy. We went up to see him. It was an extraordinary meeting. And he saw it right away. He saw the implication of the German government, the German military, finding this Jewish kid from Pittsburgh and returning him back to America, the Jewish people and his family. And he said, can we do this by D-Day 24? It's amazing. He put us in contact with the Volksbund, which is the German War Graves Commission. And there we met some extraordinary people, really extraordinary people. The secretary of the Volksbund is Brigadier General Dirk Bakken. He is one of the righteous Gentiles of the world. He's an amazing person. It's been a great privilege to get to know him. For those of you who speak a little Hebrew, you know the first letter he wrote to us was, Dear Rabbi Schachter, Kvod Harav. This is a German Brigadier General writing. He took the time to find out how do you properly address a rabbi. It was just beautiful. And at first he said this is a very difficult thing to do, but over time we went to see him in Berlin, and he was convinced then that it is the right thing to do to take this very, very long shot. The chances of finding Nathan Baskin were tiny. And we got permission. Now, there are a lot of governments involved here. We had the U.S. government involved, we had the French government involved, we had the German government involved, and the Israeli government involved. We had 8 federal agencies. And we got permission on December 18th to the 21st to basically hand exhume this grave. I led a group of 17 people. I co-led. I led it with the Germans. We had German anthropologists, French anthropologists, American anthropologists from the University of Wisconsin, and we went through an enormous amount of bones. Just think about it. Every body has 206 bones. 50 people, do the math. It's 10,000 bones. So it was really quite a very, very difficult task. Um, and we found what we thought. We knew how tall Nathan Baskin was, so the anthropologists were able to sort of reverse engineer a human, and we found remains that we thought could belong to somebody who was at that height. And then we sent those. We got permission to move those to Germany, and then from Germany to the United States. And long story short, through a wonderful DNA lab, an amazing DNA lab in the United States called Bodhi Technologies, we got perfect matches for Nathan Baskin. And Nathan Baskin is being buried on June 23rd at the Normandy American Cemetery. That is the 80th anniversary to the day that he was killed. And his family will be there, and 70 people from the United States are coming just to say thank you.
So moving. That's amazing. It's an amazing story, and so sad. Think of a young life cut short in that way. Serving his country, serving the cause of defending Western civilization, and not forgotten.
Not forgotten.
Yeah. Now, in the course of doing all this research and all of the incredible amount of work that goes into finding these remains and getting them moved through all the bureaucracy, what have you learned about American Jewry of this period that perhaps you didn't know before?
So I've learned a few things. One is the sense of dedication, very interestingly, very much like African-American fighters, let's say, of the Tuskegee Airmen. These were people enormously skilled, enormously brave, and still subject to discrimination. It's very much like Frederick Douglass didn't hate America. He revered the Constitution. And he said America is not living up to its Constitution, but the Constitution itself was spectacular. I think American Jews had the same experience. Many of them experienced terrible anti-Semitism in the U.S. Army, while at the same time they were fighting for freedom and democracy based on what America could be. America was a great country in the 1940s. It was a great country in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But it still, there were plenty of Jews who put a P instead of an H for Protestant on their dog tags because they were afraid as much of the Americans as there was of the Germans. I mean, there's a very, very important book by Deborah Dashmore, G.I. Jew, all about the anti-Semitism of the U.S. Army. Very, very important book. And what I learned about American Jews is their fealty to the Constitution, their fealty to the concept of America was amazing. I dare say, and it's a frightening question, Jonathan, if the circumstances of World War II presented themselves today, would we as a country, as a world, be willing to fight the fight against Nazism? And I'm scared of the answer. Now, to be fair, most of the era of World War II wasn't willing either. It took the greatest human being probably of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, to move against everybody, and just by the force of his somewhat crazy personality, force the world in that position. He's a pivotal figure. Does that pivotal figure exist today? I don't know, and I'd be scared to find out, frankly.
In the aftermath of World War II, American Jews, were like most Americans, mostly focused on the war itself and only secondarily interested in the fate of European Jewry and the Holocaust. I was raised, by people who had gone through the war experience, not the Holocaust experience. Although most of our family, did not come to America and they were lost. But still, it would take the passing of almost 20 years before most survivors began to speak about their experiences. And then the boom in Holocaust scholarship began. But since then, the experience of American Jews during the Second World War has seemed to fade from view. Do you think this is a subject that deserves more attention? And I think it's also interesting because we focus, rightly, and we remember the Holocaust as we must. Yet, and we remember the victims, but the idea of American Jews who served, and if you look at the numbers, they served in the same proportion as everybody else. I was very struck as I was doing a little research for this episode to see that, more than 500,000 American Jews served in the military, contrary to, anti-Semitic stereotypes, and 10,000 lost their lives, which is about the same proportion as non-Jews
right.
who served.
That's correct. So, it's a funny question because to every hammer, everything is a nail. I'm a military historian. To me, what could be more important? So I'm biased. I'm biased in that favor. But you know what? They say that history rhymes. History doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And we see those things. We know there's a brilliant lecture by Victor Davis Hanson about the causes of World War II and appeasement of evil, not wanting to confront it. We now look at Israel and Hamas in our own times, right as we're speaking. And you can see that the Chamberlains of the world, the Halifaxes of the world, frankly, so much of the intelligentsia in America, who were isolationist at the time, they allowed that vacuum of evil to flourish. And if that doesn't sound like today with Iran, that is what's happening today. And those of us who study history, those of us who are enmeshed in the results of that history, the death, the destruction, it's a frightening thing to see that we're marching along that path, whistling merrily as we go, not realizing that evil is flourishing, and it flourishes because we're gutless. It's very hard to have courage in the face of these things, but courage is required at this moment.
Yes, I think you're quite right. I mean, speaking of Victor Davis Hanson, the great historian, his most recent book, the book that just came out, is about pondering the end of civilizations and how, like when complete, horror happens and how people just don't want to believe it. They refuse. He gives some very specific examples. It's like all his books is really interesting, but obviously there's something about today's moment in history that made him think about that. Now, when we talk about the participation of American Jews in World War II and the entire topic of the way all Americans were mobilized during that war effort, there is, I think, as you just alluded to, something of a disconnect between the way that most people then thought about patriotism and their obligations to their country then and how people now do. If young Americans, were storming beaches and risking their lives 80 years ago, flying over Germany, doing their bit, leaving home for years, as my father did, for 4 years, separated from my mother. They never quite got over that, to be perfectly honest, although he was among the lucky ones who came home. But today, the image that comes to mind of young Americans is of, the campus protests that we've just seen and a population of young people who've really been more or less indoctrinated in woke ideology and a general contempt for America, its history, its values. And by contrast, I think of young Israelis and, anybody who's been to Israel in the last 7 months, as I've been, they're serving in the war against Hamas. And when you speak to them, they sound a lot like my father's generation, which served in World War II, with the idea of, well, this isn't something that we would choose to do, but we know we have to fight for our homes, our families, and for our country.
Let me give you an optimistic view, perhaps a little naive, but optimistic anyway. Before October 7th, I live in Jerusalem, so I think most Israelis had the view that this is a softer generation. They're not tested by trial. They have their interest in iPads and in high tech. But when the crisis came, that fateful October 7th came, the transformation of this generation into absolutely heroic, unimaginable bravery, and how the entire society was mobilized behind them, the acts of kindness, the acts of chesed that went on, were staggering. My daughter, I have a number of sons-in-law in the Army, and my daughter told us that her meal trains have meal trains. There were so many people volunteering to help the wives of the soldiers who were fighting. And I think we saw that they truly, magnificently rose to that moment. Do I think that would happen in America? I hope America never gets tested like that. It's hard for me to imagine. But if you go back to 9/11, Americans did respond in great numbers. And you can't compare a country like America, which is surrounded by Canada and Mexico and two oceans, to Israel. They're just in two wildly different circumstances. But when 9/11 came, there was a surge of patriotism. There was a surge of enlisting into the armed forces. So that sort of did happen. So I'm going to take a slightly optimistic view, although, like everyone else, who's not troubled by the country at the moment. Again, I have to avoid politics because it's not what I do. I do history, and I have people who support us from every different level, right, left, and in between. So I'm going to avoid politics. But I mean, I think everybody's concerned.
Yeah, well, I don't really think it's a political issue. The question of, how you feel about your country, that's not that's not a liberal or conservative idea, patriotism, or believing in the idea of America and America's values. But it does seem to have, these people who are chanting for Israel's destruction are also saying death to America, and, deeply troubling. And now, one of the things we've learned in the last 7 months is something that was, I think, long apparent, in that most young Americans don't seem to know much history, whether it is about their own country or the Middle East. We can blame that on the failures of our education system or social media and smartphones. But what do you think, if anything, we can do to revive interest in the study of history?
So that's a great question. I first of all, history is fascinating, but it needs to be taught in a fascinating way. I'll just give you for instance. I'm a big believer in experiential education. You cannot help but get excited by going to Civil War battlefields. What kid wouldn't want to go to Gettysburg, to Antietam, to Fredericksburg?
Assuming that they don't think Gettysburg was something that happened, in the 17th century.
Oh, yeah, but that's the way you learn about it, right? You learn about it by going, and all of a sudden these dates start meaning things, and Robert E. Lee means something, and Ulysses S. Grant means something, and all these things start to come to life, and you can pique the imagination. I think just like religion is story-based. We've stopped telling the stories about America. It's very troubling when we don't have a common language. You can be born in Poland, move to America, but still know that the founding fathers were the founding fathers, even though your parents were in Poland at that time, as the case with my family. But the founding fathers, as far as I'm concerned, were Thomas Jefferson, et cetera, Ben Franklin, and all these guys. And they had to tell those stories is the way to create a common language. You can be from anywhere, from Slovenia, Poland, Russia, or Brooklyn, your ancestors. But if we tell those stories, we tell them in an interesting way, it's great. The problem is when we tell distorted stories, that America is sort of this original sin, the 1619 Project, that dastardly, horrible thing. That's an awful way to look at America. It is inconceivable to see our world today, the standard of livings around the world, and not come to the conclusion that the economic miracle that was the United States is what lifted 1 billion people out of poverty. It is insane not to acknowledge that. Did America have problems on the way there? Sure. We're aspirational. The Constitution is an aspirational document. It's a covenant that we made and that we continue to have, and we can always improve. But this idea that we started in sin and that we're a terrible country, and this is insanity, and it's destructive in the worst possible way. When one looks at American history, warts and all, we have everything to be immensely, immensely proud of. Let me go back to one of our soldiers. And it's kind of a neat thing. There's a young man named Everett Seixas Jr. So right now, Junior, he's either a German Jew or he's Sephardic. So he's a Sephardic Jew. The Seixas family goes back to the earliest parts of the settlement in America. They're originally from Spain, then Portugal, then England, then moved to the United States 5 years before George Washington was born. So this is an old family. Members of the old. So if you remember, George Washington wrote a very famous letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, about giving bigotry no sanction. It's a beautiful, fantastic letter.
Toro Synagogue.
So this letter from George Washington was written to this young man, Everett Seixas, to his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. So this is a long, patriotic, amazing family. Everett Seixas was an only child. He was a Brown University graduate, Columbia Law School graduate. He easily could have gotten out of this fight, but he joined the Army. He was killed in the Battle of the Bulge. You mentioned the Battle of the Bulge before. He was killed very violently in the Battle of the Bulge and was buried under a cross. And there he was. His family had no idea. For decades, for 78 years, he was buried under a cross. And when we went, he's buried in Luxembourg. So when we went to the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, we went to change that cross. The American ambassador to Luxembourg was there, spoke very beautifully. The Israeli ambassador was there, who also spoke beautifully. And it was an amazing experience. I want to tell you a little story that I think you'll enjoy about the sins of America. So when these soldiers were buried, they were buried under an American flag, which was then folded into the iconic triangle, and that was sent back home to the families. Very few of the families, for reasons that I will never understand, still have that flag. But this family had that flag. So I said, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but can I take that flag with me to Europe and be with that flag, with this soldier, when we change that headstone? So
can I just stop you for a minute before we finish that story? The reason why they were buried under crosses, was it prejudice? Was it just mistakes? Or just the assumption that most Americans were one variety of Christian or not?
So let's take a break in the story and go back and answer that very, very good question. So it's an obvious question. How did this happen? And the answer is, with one single exception, we'll put him to the side for a moment, it was mistakes. These were innocent errors by a country trying very hard to do the right thing. And when you go through the documentation, I've been through thousands of these files, with one exception, it was all done innocently. People really, really tried to do their best. Why did it happen? How did this happen? Well, give me a few reasons. One is most people don't realize 5,000 Americans were killed every month of the war, right? And if you think about that,
a total of about 400,000.
That's right. And if you think about it, this is an age before computers. How did you follow all these? And most soldiers were buried in Europe 3, 4, 5 times. In the Pacific, they were buried up to 7 or 8 times. They were buried on the battlefield, then taken to a holding area, and then taken to a larger station, et cetera, et cetera. In the Pacific, it was worse because you had all these little islands, and so they were buried again and again and again. So you can imagine just the clerical errors. In the pre-computer era, it was very, very easy to make clerical mistakes. But there was something that Jews did, for good reasons, that helped cause this problem. And that was, they used to have on their dog tag an H for Hebrew, right? In the Civil War, we were I for Israelites. Then it became H for Hebrews. A lot of Jews didn't want to have that H on their dog tag. They'd rather have a P for Protestant, thinking, if I get captured, the last thing I want to do is be identified as a Jew. Or if I'm in a barracks and I have some nasty guy from Mississippi or Alabama or wherever it was, I really don't want this guy to be hitting me because I'm a Hebrew, I'm a Jewish. And so a lot of guys put on a P just to protect themselves, not thinking, because they're young, that they might get killed. So when they got killed, what's the poor guy from Graves Registration supposed to do? He's in the middle of a battle, he finds a dead soldier, and it says P on his dog tag, so he puts it under a cross. It's perfectly reasonable, right? And if there was a question, if it was a damaged dog tag, then 97% of casualties were Christian. So default, it made sense. And this went on and on and on. So if you buried him once under a cross, the second guy wasn't going to change. You buried him under a cross, buried him under a cross, and the mistake got compounded and compounded and compounded. The beauty, the brilliance, the thankfulness that we should have for the historians of the American Battle Monuments Commission is they recognize that by somebody putting a P or a C for Catholic on their dog tag was a meaningless profession of faith. It had no bearing. They want us to do the research to say, who was this guy really, not what did he have on his dog tag. Other countries where there are guys who do the same work we do have a much harder time because their grave commissions say that if a guy put a P on his dog tag, that's it. That's a profession of faith. Thank God the Americans are smart enough to know history didn't work that way. Very important to be an accurate historian, and the Americans have done it brilliantly, as a matter of fact. Let me go back to Everett Satius. Great story.
Please.
So I've got this flag. It's in the iconic triangle, and it's in pretty good shape. We check it out, and we know that this is absolutely the correct flag that it was. We know the manufacturer. We know how it came, and all these. We have the transmittal letter. It's the accurate flag. The superintendent of the Luxembourg American Cemetery, it's a wonderful, wonderful person, Chris Arsenault. And the other guy, aside from our Everett Satius, who's buried at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, is General George Patton. Now, that's a big deal. General George Patton is a big deal. He was the iconic general, this swashbuckling, larger-than-life figure. He was also a raging anti-Semite. He hated Jews. He was very open about it. He wrote about it. And it's actually disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. So you can't go to the Luxembourg American Cemetery and not visit the grave of George Patton. So we had a dilemma. I'm bringing 50 or 60 people with us on our bus. We're coming from America. We don't want to disgrace, turn our backs on George Patton. He was a great anti-Nazi. He was a great American. He was an iconic general. On the other hand, he hated us. I mean, he was very open about it. So I was troubled by that, obviously very troubled. And I spoke to Chris, had a very open conversation with him. And he said, rather than have a docent show you General Patton's grave, I would like to give you the tour of General Patton's grave, understanding that you have a very tough relationship with him. And he was marvelous. But he had a great idea, and it was just brilliant. He said, you know what? You're bringing that flag of this Jewish soldier with you to the Luxembourg American Cemetery. Let's play George one good. Let's fly the flag of this Jewish soldier over the Luxembourg American Cemetery on the day you do the headstone change. And there was General George Patton in all his glory flying under the American flag of a Jewish soldier. And there was a little beauty, a little poetry there that was quite beautiful. And listen, we all went to pay our respects to George Patton. He was in numbers of great numbers of respects, a very great American, a very great general, and he did America proud in that sense. He did have a huge character flaw, and we paid him back with a little bit of flag waving.
That's a great story, and of course you're right. General Patton was part of the effort that defeated the Nazis, and a major part of it, and he deserves to be remembered for that as well as some of his personal flaws. Shalom Lamm, thanks so much for these stories and for what you're doing and for your insights on all of it. You can learn more about Operation Benjamin by going to their website, operationbenjamin.org. And program note, remember, we'll be taking a break next week and then returning on June 20th with a new version of the show called Think Twice. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune into the daily edition of this podcast. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.